There are three additional, generally unaccepted accounting principles. Let's go through them as well, because as fiduciary stewards of the company, you're going to be asked to look at them very carefully. One is, and this is actually from a legal compliance and regulatory and risk management perspective, because a lot of companies have gotten tripped up on this and the auditors have missed it. The first one is what I would call off-balance sheet activities. And the battle still continues over the disclosure of trillions of dollars of assets that the investment community calls shadowy, shady, opaque, or Enron-esque. What's tremendously interesting about this, for example, in leases, capitalized leases, apparently around the world there's about $3 trillion of leases from equipment, machinery, and real estate leases and capitalized leases that are they just don't exist anywhere on the financial statements of an entity. $3 trillion of liabilities that don't appear anywhere on the financial statements. But the arguments against disclosure are familiar, and they're not too dissimilar to those presented by opponents of the Securities Acts of 33 and 34, until Richard Whitney, the head of the New York Stock Exchange, committed a $100 million Ponzi fraud and served as a catalyst for adoption of security regulation laws in the United States over 70 years ago. In fact, Whitney's Ponzi scheme was actually greater than Ponzi's Ponzi scheme. Off-balance sheet activities serve very important financial reporting objectives for the entity that needs to manipulate results. It allows the company to report better results than it should have been, that is, taking assets and debt and related debt off the balance sheet and present financial statements in a much better light. Among the best manipulators were Enron's Fasto, who employed his financial engineering skills to manage the reported results, according to Hamilton and Micklethwait. Off-balance sheet activities are often misleading, but when used successfully provide companies with better returns, significantly better bonuses, and keep shareholders, analysts, raters, and prospective investors totally in the dark. One of the most interesting off-balance sheet activities were financial instruments called Qualified Special Purpose Entities, QSPEs. These are the darlings of the bank, and they still exist. They're the vehicle of choice through which U.S. banks bundled vast pools of loans off their balance sheets and away from the eyes of investors and regulators, according to Jennifer Hughes of the Financial Times in June 27th of 2009. And after fighting disclosure for over a decade, and much more actively since 2002, the last time a crisis hit, and the regulators determined that the oops factor was too big to ignore, and it was going to hurt them as well, the FASB issued a draft, and 130 banks at the time fought against disclosing QSPEs, including Citibank, whose liability in this area is now expected to be over $100 billion, $150 billion. Now, as of next year, Citibank is going to be required to book them, but booking them doesn't mean consolidating them or putting them on the balance sheet. Booking them means disclosing them in either financials, which they can bury them in, or in footnote disclosures. The expectation by the Federal Reserve is that almost $750 billion will need to be disclosed by the top 19 banks. Credit default swaps, still in existence and probably larger today than they were 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, are one of the largest asset classes in the world that do not exist anywhere on the corporate financial statement. They don't appear on the books of financial institutions. At over $60 trillion, 4 times the U.S. gross domestic product, a few billion of credit default swaps at Lehman Brothers almost seized the market. Now, is there any rationale under any principle not to include them on the balance sheet? But as a corporate fiduciary, as a steward of the company, you're going to see this. And at least if it doesn't have to be disclosed, you can at least make sure that there's some protection, insurance, and reserve against these for the protection of the stakeholders. So by just sheer size, materiality, risk, and importance, off-balance sheet financing rates number 6 on my list of generally unacceptable accounting principles. 7, fraud prevention. Audits initially under the Securities Acts of 33 and 34, audits were designed to protect the public against fraud. However, recently, auditing and financial fraud prevention became an obligation no longer assumed by auditors. An audit in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards provides no assurance, according to the Statement on Auditing Standards, provides no assurance that illegal acts will be detected or that any contingent liabilities that result will be disclosed. Of course, this is auditing standards from the AICPA before the self-regulatory standards were taken away from them, but that has not changed. And as an aside, we talk about audit committees, and I think you see a lot of discussion about audit committees, and you in fact may be on an audit committee or being put on discussions with audit committees, or as corporate counsel have discussions with the audit committee and the auditors. But unfortunately, audit committees have fared no better than the auditor in the detection or prevention of fraud. At Enron, for example, the audit committee was headed by the former dean of Stanford University's business school and other distinguished members, who was reported met 4 or 5 times a year for about 2 hours and discussed at least 7 or 8 critical issues. Any one of these items could have taken days to resolve, and they spent 2 hours 4 times a year. So they completely missed the signs, and they actually missed the questions that they needed to ask. And as a result, you have a fraud of the likes of Enron. And finally, my 8th generally unaccepted accounting principle is fairly stated. The International Federation, the IFRS statements, financial reporting statements, focuses on faithful, as in honest, good faith representation of the financials. To date, our financial statements require fair representation. Does this mean that the financial statements are truthful, accurate, ethical, moral, or presented for the benefit of society to help it understand the business better? That is this a socially responsible accounting principle for vendors and customers, employees and shareholders? Well, remarkably, no. Our statements only need to be fairly presented in all material aspects of the financial position of the entity, but only in conformity with generally accepted accounting principles. What's very interesting is the auditing standards were reproduced, and the financial reports were reproduced in 1968 in a book published by AICPA. Before that time, the auditing standards required two factors. Number one, the financial reports had to be fairly presented, both in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, and also fairly presented. Let me say that again. Before 1968, there were 2 requirements of financial reporting. Number one, financial statements had to be fairly presented, and in addition, had to be presented in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. After 1968, that word, for some reason or other, in the literature was dropped, and all the statements have to be reported today only fairly presented in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, not necessarily fairly presented and in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. So the fairness opinion does not require truth, factual correctness, or 100% accuracy. It requires adherence to a gap, which we've seen is not clearly defined, it's not objectively measured, nor scientifically determined. And among the hedge funds who really try to determine the reality behind the financials, the mantra is profit is opinion, cash is fact. As with Anderson and Enron, the sum of all these decisions can result in a picture that is far from true and fair, has apparently become irrelevant as opposed to producing accounts that present accurate pictures of the corporation as a whole. The conclusion of Hamilton and Mecklethwaite. So that about rounds up our discussion of the generally unacceptable accounting principles and why it's so important as fiduciaries and stewards of the corporate entity and the stakeholders you serve why fairness and accuracy and truthfulness have to be preserved, and frankly, only you will see those in a way that no one outside the company, in fact, not even the auditors, will see.